Right, how does that look? Nice little collage. Thank you very much. Oh, I've still got the thing open, so let me just shut that down. Right, there are 5 people in here. To my knowledge, we've got Rooney Bear, Alex H. Leal, Brooke Stardust, and I'm not quite sure who else, but there are another 6 people in here, so there's and hopefully the hopefully it's all working well with the sound. I've got a cup of tea, so you'll probably hear lots of me stopping to have a sip from that. And the next chapter, oh, just to run through the pictures here. Up in this corner, there's part of a picture by Orange Punch. That's the full version, which was based on Annals of Fear, but I had to like doctor it a little bit to get it to fit in the gap. Oh no, it's refusing point blank to. Oh, well, refusing point blank to fit in my gap. I've moved it up so that we can see Mello and Matti underneath here. Oh, that'd be a half decent shot. There we go. Of the house. Oh. It's all good, I'm just trying to fit loads of bits in. Down here we've got Deontic as envisaged by Sylvia, Maka Spoiled Kitten. And up in the corner here we've got Sentry as seen by Brooke Stardust. Oh, there's no sound, I'm being told. Help. Oh, sorry, I didn't have the microphone down. Oh God, that was such a fail. In that case, let me just run through those pictures again. Up in the top corner there's some detail of a picture based on Annals of Fear 1, which was done by Orange Punch. Down the bottom there is Deontic as envisaged by Spoiled Kitten, and up in the corner is Sentry as envisaged by Brooke Stardust, and the rest is my wallpaper with various pictures. Oh, various pictures taken off the internet. I'm being told that the sound is being a real bitch at the moment. And it seems to finish my sentences after a pause. It's back now. Look. Right, will you let me know if the sound goes a bit pear-shaped again? Thank you. Cool. I'm being told in chat that the sound is behaving itself now, so I hope it stays like that. Right, a quick sip of tea and then I'll start reading you stories. Oh wait, the sound's gone again. Let me open up the monitor so I can... No, it's saying perfect streaming down there. The microphone is switched on. The CPU is jumping in between 57 and 81 suddenly. What kind of behaviour is that? Stop or lower quality, it's telling me. It's working. What I could do is really lower the quality. Just go for... Oh, it's now telling me perfect streaming. I don't know, it's up to you in chat. Do you want me to switch it off and lower the quality as far as I can go? I think there was one that was like about 190 kbps, which is extremely low, but whereas this one is something like 400 and something kbps. Okay, my people on the ground are telling me it's working now. Alright, it's the power of tea. I took a sip of tea and everything started working beautifully. Which is something that those people up in New England will never get the pleasure of, on account of throwing it all in their arbour. Right, I'm now going to read you a story. This is chapter 22, Lost. Matt saw the legs of the tripod being lowered down, but he called out, "Hold on, just 2 secs." It wobbled slightly, no doubt because Deontic was trembling up there. A little voice in the back of his head told him he should be talking to her, just to keep them both calm. But he had nothing to say to any of them at Whammy's, and he still didn't. They were the others, the people outside the little circle of himself and Mello, and they were nothing to do with him. He stepped back right up against the wall, using his mobile phone to photograph the red symbol painted on the floor. It took some doing because it was cold in here, and he was shaking a little because of that, as well as having to hold the torch. The picture kept coming out blurry. He took a few until he found one which properly captured it. It was the same symbol as on the album cover. Matt eyed the dead foliage, dried and brown around the edges of the tiny room. He photographed these in sections too, and then turned his attention to the sheep skulls and the candles. None of these things had been mentioned to Mello. Matt had gestured wildly upon sight of them not to mention them to Mello. Not while the blonde was so agitated up there. "Matt!" Deontic cried out, and the legs of the tripod disappeared upwards again. "One moment," Matt murmured, but neither knew nor cared if she heard him. He photographed the little jar in situ too. That had been mentioned before he could stop Sentry, but they seemed to have got away with it. Matt had to admit that Mello was doing his head in. Usually the unpredictability and the violence were turn-ons, but then Mello generally did it in style. This evening he seemed more like a petulant child, tantruming because he wasn't going his own way. Attacking Sentry was like kicking a kitten. It wasn't sexy, it was immature. And anyway, they were all annoying him. Deontic, so often reserved and professional, had been weeping and fawning like some girl. Sentry had channelled all of that Whammy's House rebellion that he was so infamous for straight at Mello. If Sentry didn't keep winding Mello up, then the Slav wouldn't be half so bad right now. His pictures finished, Matt pondered on how he was going to handle Mello after this. Matt had been enjoying the game until now, letting Deontic see how many times he could stand up to Mello, and Mello would just let him. But Mello had started to notice, and it was picking his paranoia. It was fucking awkward. Matt sighed and called out, "I'm ready for the camera now, Dee." There was no stirring up above. Matt shone his torch towards the ladder and could not see the tripod legs. "Deontic," he rasped, a little more loudly in case she couldn't hear him properly down here. He was gagging for a cigarette. He would have one as soon as he'd placed the camera. He stepped forward, looking up. There was no glimpse of the room here. Matt shone his torch up, eyes widening at the sight of floorboards. "You have got to be fucking kidding me." Matt leapt onto the ladder, his hand rising to push them off. It wasn't funny. It wasn't a joke. The floorboards didn't budge. Matt reeled backwards, standing at the front of the ladder, hardly daring to try and reason this out. He'd heard no banging. There was no way that the floorboards could have been secured. He would have heard the nails being hammered back in. He would have heard the scraping of furniture being piled on top. This wasn't happening. Mello was going to hit the roof. Matt wiped his mouth and climbed up again, whacking the floorboards hard with his gloved fist. They were stuck tight. Matt jumped up and down and hunted through his pockets for his cigarettes. There was no lighter. He systematically explored all of his pockets and then remembered there had been matches next to the candles. He took one and lit his cigarette. He pretended not to notice how much he was shaking. The room quickly became extremely smoky. It was not a big room. Matt didn't care. He sucked on the cigarette, waiting for the rush of calm that would allow him to reason this out. The important thing was not to panic. Mello was out there. An insidious voice in his head kept demanding to know how the floorboards had been slotted into place without his hearing. It had to be Deontic. Matt paused. He wanted to believe that this was Deontic, because anything else was seriously going to freak him out. He called up, "Dee." There was no response. Louder now. "Deontic." Nothing. "Pequan, come on now, this isn't funny." Not even the sound of her footsteps. Fuck it. Matt shone the torch at the wall, where some 16th century painter had created a crude image of Christ and his mother. He focused on them as if that would telepathically get a message to Mello. Then he smiled. He didn't need telepathy. He had a mobile phone. Good. The nicotine was working. His brain was working again. He clutched his phone in his left hand and unlocked the keypad again. He used the speed dial and the screen lit up with Mello's name. But it was not ringing. Matt took a sharp intake of breath and inspected it. There was no signal here. Why had he taken his headset off downstairs? Fuck it. Stay angry, Mile, he told himself. Don't panic. This isn't an oil tanker. It's not a cave beneath a chalk mountain. It's a fucking room in a house. Stay angry. Matt kept trying, moving around the tiny space, lifting the phone up to the ceiling and down to the floor. The rest of the house had a signal. There had to be one, but there was none. He took a drag on his cigarette and held the smoke in his throat, and then slowly exhaled. Now he yelled at the top of his voice, "Mello! Mello! Mello!" Deontic tried not to feel alarmed, as she was first sentry, then Mello leave. There was still Matt. She was not technically alone up here. Still, that didn't help at all when bending over the gap in the floorboards rendered her with the back to the rest of the room. Her imagination supplied the rest. Drowned, ghostly women standing behind her. Footsteps and music starting with her right in their epicentre. Spectral entities at the window. She tried to banish them from her mind as she lowered the tripod down. The cigarette was still attached to the top, and the lead was now fixed into place with gaffer tape. All Matt had to do was take it, and then he would open the legs again, put it down, climb up, and they would be out of here. "Hold on, just 2 secs," Matt said, in that soft, uninterested voice of his. Deontic could have strangled him. She was visibly trembling with fear and cold, and he was faffing down doing something in that hole. Mello would be back in a minute, demanding to know why they weren't following right behind him. The two boys might be seemingly amused to his yelling and intimidation, but it still cut her to the core. It was as if Greece and all that she had said to them had fallen on deaf ears. They didn't want to go along, even if cooperation here meant them all watching each other's backs. All Sentry had gone on about while they were in Aberystwyth was this case ought to have been his. Deontic peered fretfully over her own shoulder, but the room remained empty and without supernatural sounds. She stayed looking in the highly irrational fear that if she was watching, then nothing would happen. It would be when she took her eyes off the scene that something would creep up behind her. She glanced at the doorway, but the Mother Mary figurine had gone. She hoped that Mello had taken it. She sighed, her arms aching with holding this tripod so long into space. She shouldn't have come. She knew that now. She was too emotionally knocked about by the death of Lamond. It had been bad enough losing the others, but Lamond's death had been the final straw. Suddenly every hurt and loss had flooded into her system as if a dam had burst and allowed the waters through. She had managed to keep it in check until a long night talk with Linda and Luigi had finally prompted Deontic to see the psychiatrist that Hal had installed in Wammy's house. It had helped. It had really helped. But right here it felt as if this house had undone everything. Deontic sniffed, determined not to cry again. She concentrated on another nagging thought, which is that she could call Hal. Hal, who had called her up with barely suppressed glee in her voice, stating that the 3 people whom she most wanted watching were going to be in a Wattori-owned house overnight. Deontic arrived with a dual task. She was to assess Sentry's well-being as an independent observer, so tick a few boxes in Wattery's duty of care towards a minor, and she was to watch Mello and Matt together to see if there was any accountability vis-à-vis Matt's dependency upon her violent husband. Deontic inwardly snorted. That seemed laughable now. If anything, Matt was the quietly dominant one. Mello had appeared downright vulnerable several times, while Matt could be a right bitch sometimes. It was... Downstairs there was a gunshot. Deontic nearly dropped the tripod in shock. "Matt!" she called out in alarm, and pulled the tripod back up. Mello's anger and Sentry's provocation sped through her mind. She set the tripod against the wall and fled the kitchen, her mind racing through the first aid for gunshot wounds. She wondered if the police were there still. They couldn't be. Even Mello wasn't that crazy. But the main thought of her mind was, please don't let him be dead. Deontic landed in the sitting room, hearing and feeling the silence empty heavily in the house. They weren't in there. She knew that before she even hurried into the kitchen, and then cut out through the other rooms. Had the shot come from outside? Deontic scurried to the window and cupped her hands around it. She saw Sentry. He was running down the slope. Her heart caught, skipping a beat, but she ran too, past the pile where her coat was folded, snatching it up en route. The back door was open. She followed the draught and hurtled through it. There was no sign of Mello. She imagined him up there on the mountain, firing down upon the teenager. The police had gone. Deontic pulled her coat as she ran, around the outside of the house and through a small patio garden. She leaned on a dry stone wall and peered over. Sentry was down there, still running. Deontic yelled, "Sentry!" But the wind took her words. She span on the spot, looking for any sign of Mello, cursing Matt for not being behind her. "Mello!" she called out. "This is stupid, leave him!" She was being watched. She could feel the gaze burning on her skin. "Mello, please, please, this isn't worthy of you." She leaned over the wall again. Sentry was passing out of view. Deontic opened the metal gate and raced down the slope. The steepness of it took her by surprise. It felt like she couldn't stop running now if she had wanted to, and it was all she could do not to fall down here, rolling the rest of the way down to the river at the bottom. All the time she feared that the second shot, the one that would ring out, fear in Mello's position and maybe killing one of them. It occurred to her that he could already be down there, chasing after Sentry, out of her view. Deontic half ran and half stumbled down the mountainside until the mist covered her. She could hear the river roaring so close, but Sentry had to be here somewhere. She yelled again, "Sentry! It's Deontic, where are you?" But the furious waters drowned out her words, and the thick fog deadened them even to her own ears. She turned this way and that, but she couldn't see him. "Mello!" she called out, in case he was closer. "Mello, it's Deontic. Let's talk about this." No response but the gushing river. She remembered what Matt had implied about Mello needing praise, too often watching near receive it all. "Mello, you were always my hero," she yelled. "You beat us all." She took a step backwards, not daring to go too far forward. She didn't know the land, and it was foolishness to attempt it blind. She stood on the spot, not knowing where to go or what to do. This was ridiculous. She was a Whammies House alumnus. What would Elle have done? She had heard so much praise for his fearlessness. She wouldn't have hung around indecisively fretting. Deontic rushed forward down to what she could see of a dirt track. It must be the river path, and he had to have gone down this way. There were footprints in the soil. Deontic hurried on, the mist swallowing her environment all around her as she moved. Then she placed her left foot and the ground gave way. Deontic tumbled through mud and briar until she landed on a bed of rocks right at the water's edge. Her feet were in it, sopping wet and freezing. She yelped and withdrew them, reaching out for foliage and whatever else her hand could find to gain purchase. She stood, hands clasped and panic rising. She allowed herself a little stamp on the spot, shrieking out of fright, and then stood several deep breaths and steadied herself. She was all right. That was the important thing. Disorientated in a world that was suddenly water and mist, but she was all right. Deontic attempted to climb back up the way she'd come, but it was all prickly branches, scratching her hands to shreds. She gave up and peered into the mist either side along the riverbank. Rocks rolled on as far as she could see, which wasn't far. She took a few paces along, back in the direction that it must pass the house. The ground underfoot became soggy as the river seeped through stones. She stepped back, trying the other way, and she thought she saw movement in the mist. "Sentry!" she cried out, hearing the fright in her own voice. But there was no reply. "Mello!" Nothing. She trudged on anyway, until she suddenly realised that on either side of the large rocks upon which she scrambled, the river was cascading down. She was walking into it, and it was ferocious, raging like the drainage from a monsoon. Deontic stopped dead, unable to see through tears. "Ebucha," she whimpered. "Too long." Sentry felt quite sorry for Hilachli. They were just ordinary police officers who'd received a call from Watery. They were stonily professional, and yet a closer inspection saw the concern in their eyes. This would be a call with already far-reaching consequences. He could practically watch their thought processes pass from "this could help my career" into "am I going to get into trouble for this?" He doubted that any of them actually knew who Watery was. It could have been someone higher up the train barking orders, though he did note a sergeant's 3 stripes upon one arm. They were demanding access, was keeping an eye on Mello, who was on his mobile phone getting this sorted out. "Mein Treidach." Mello Sentry apologised for probably the 20th time, because it tended to stall them. Every time he noticed them gearing up to ask him to come inside again, he threw in another sorry, and then entered the conversation into innocuous things, like the weather. "Mein Weirtag?" he asked, exaggerating his shiver in the next gust of wind, though it was actually quite warm. "And is it stormy down here in the wat?" The eldest head was doing all of the talking, while his sergeant watched Mello like a hawk. He responded with conversational politeness. "My chwin iawn." Sentry nodded sympathetically. The weather was a safe conversation. The Welsh liked to talk about the weather, probably because they had so much of it to talk about. There was a squeal on the sergeant's radio, and she responded to the voice hurriedly talking through it. Watery was ordering them to withdraw. Nothing to see here, all a big misunderstanding. Sentry could tell that they were dying to ask questions and to linger, but they couldn't. There would be someone in authority wanting this done by the book. Well, whatever book they had to deal with, mysterious organisations like Watery. "Sure," he waved, trying to look like a friendly 17-year-old. "Nastar." "Nastar," came the response from several voices, some suspicious, some gruff, and the spokeswoman Hethwas was still diplomatically cheery. With the last good night they returned to their cars and were gone, a lot more quietly than they'd arrived. Sentry was alone with Mello. It was precisely the situation he'd wanted to avoid. After that episode with the gun, Deontic had promised him over a cup of tea in Aberystwyth that she would personally ensure that he was never alone with Mello. Yet here they both were. What did Hal say? Mello seemed preoccupied, turning to look back through the kitchen window several feet behind. "Where are Matt and Deontic?" Sentry shrugged. He didn't know, and he was blowed if he was going to make small talk with a man who had twice attacked him. The whole right side of his body still hurt. Deontic pushed a lollipop into his mouth and shoved his hands deep into his pockets. The wind really was quite cold for August, though it felt close. He hadn't lied to the Athwas there. Mello was heading back, but Sentry reasoned that while he personally was outside, he should go and see if his phone was around. If he'd have survived the fall from the window, then he'd need it. He cast a filthy look at Mello's back and wandered away towards the side of the house. Mello's voice trailed after him. "Sentry, where do you think you're going?" Sentry huddled into himself as he quickened his pace, like he could already feel the punch in his back or the grabbing of his throat. Mello was indeed running after him. Sentry called back over his shoulder. I'm going to find my phone that you—" The wind ripping around the front of the house took his breath away at the corner. Sentry could feel his teeth starting to chatter as he dithered there. He heard Mello call his name again, but Sentry ignored him. He and Mello would have words sooner or later, but he would rather it not be in a gale when it happened. There was enough light spilling out from the windows to illuminate part of the garden, less than Sentry would have hoped, but he quickly scanned what he could see. There was no such luck in seeing it quickly, so he'd have to grab it before Mello came to make a scene. He saw a promising shadow and headed towards it, praying silently that his phone was intact and not soaked in dew. He bent towards it, but it was only a piece of rockery. That's when the gunshot whistled right overhead. Sentry didn't wait. The same instinct that had kept him alive when he was 8 galvanised him now.
He fled before he'd even had a chance to consciously note that, had he still been standing straight, the bullet would have gone straight through his head. He was halfway down the hill and behind a bush before the shock had properly formed. Mello had actually tried to kill him. Though all his past fears and hysteria of the night before, it occurred to Sentry now that deep down he would never have believed that Mello would pull the trigger. Fear was Mello's weapon of choice, not bullets. The gun was a prop. Fenian had told him years ago that the trick with Mello was not to show fear. If you stood up to him, he'd tend to shrink away. All bullies did. Not that had helped Fenian as much as if fear was too stark, but Sentry had played the tactic well. At least he thought he had, until yesterday. Sentry bit down on his lip to try and still the sound of his breathing. He peeped through the bush, but he was too far down here. A whole section of the upper slopes were blindsided. Mello could get within 10 feet if he crawled on his front, before Sentry could even know he was there. But that was all that Sentry needed. He was back on his feet and hurtling down the hill. It was open countryside, and therefore he would show up on the slope in the moonlight. Equally, though, it forced Mello into plain view, and Sentry couldn't see him. He needed cover, and there was only the river down there. Sentry's mind spanned through the geography, which he'd made a point of noting. There was the woodland, he would head for that. He would climb it again under the cover of it and make for the road. There might be a passing vehicle which he could flag down. Sentry ran. He concentrated on the running, trying to keep at bay memories of other gunshots and another flight across a Welsh mountain. That was further north, but the parallels were there. Sentry couldn't think of that, not now, especially not now. He ran on until he met barbed wire, and beyond it the wood. He leapt at the post, one hand out as leverage, scaled over the fence, and he was over. He'd made the wood. He was safe, unless his luck ran out and he met with Mello in the darkness. Mello's genius mind tracking him through the trees, and then a gunshot. Execution. Sentry's breath caught in phobia, and he lunged forward, away. Mello watched through the kitchen window for any sign of Matt and Deontic. It bothered him that they hadn't followed him down, unless, of course, they were in the sitting room. On the kitchen table, the bank of laptops illuminated the back wall, their presence an accusation against his own incompetence. He should have been on the ball. He set this thing up with Chrissy and Salvo, so he should have ensured that they got the all clear. To be fair, Chrissy wasn't having a go at him. She was in conference call with himself and Hal, but seemed mostly concerned that they were all right. Mello heard the subtext anyhow. He'd fucked up and Chrissy knew it. Half the freaking whammies knew it. He glanced at Sentry, but the teenager was still engaged in conversation with the police officers. Over the phone they could hear Hal in the background on a different line, calling the officers away. Chrissy sighed. "Mello, do you still want us to watch? Only it's getting quite late and we don't get much sleep as it is with the baby." Mello's gaze locked upon the sergeant's. She was precisely what he didn't need. She looked sharp. Mello flashed her a smile which he hoped showed all of his nastier inner demons. He didn't like her. "Yes," he replied to Chrissy. "A lot of things aren't adding up, and those which do aren't pretty." He gazed back through the window, trying to discern movement in the far room. "I'm sorry." Hal was back. "They're going to leave, Mello. Is there anything else I can do?" Chrissy answered for her. "Yes, you can monitor the messages from the house. Once an hour, No," Mello interrupted. "Chrissy, there's a reason it's you and Salvo. You know us." He hesitated, considering the fact that they really didn't. They'd spent all of their formative years ensuring that none of them knew each other. "I'm sorry, Hal, but Chrissy has known us for longer. She'd get it in an instant if any of us were behaving out of character." "Is it really that important?" Chrissy sighed. In the yards, the police officers were leaving. She seemed to be gearing up to say more, so Mello responded with a curt, "Yes, got to go." He hurriedly said his goodbyes and cut the connection. The cars were leaving in a ribbon of red lights. Mello watched them leave through the gate and heard the click as it was closed behind them. The sound of their engines became muffled by the mountainside, but their lights could still be seen, almost ghostly, as they moved away. "What did Hal say?" Sentry asked. Mello stood on tiptoe to peer back through the kitchen window. He couldn't see movement at all in there. Cold fear gripped his insides, but he forced himself to remain icily calm. "Where are Matt and Deontic?" He took a step towards the back door, but a crunch of boots on the cobbles alerted him to the fact that Sentry was wandering off. Mello bit down the stab of annoyance. He desperately wanted to be inside. Alarm bells were ringing through his mind, and he hoped it was just paranoia. If he could just see Matti, would be fine. He tore his attention away from the window and turned to where Sentry had been drifting. There was no sign of him. He'd gone around the corner. Mello swallowed the rush of anger. He called out calmly enough, "Sentry, where do you think you're going?" There was no response. Torn between going inside or following the teenager, Mello momentarily froze on the spot. That was unlike him and shot another flare of alarm straight through his psyche. They weren't safe. Fuck paranoia. They weren't safe. He would grab Sentry, get inside and grab Matt and Deontic, jump into a car and drive away from here to think through this house's influence. Mello blinked. The house had influence? Mello's fist closed over the crucifix at the end of his rosary, and then inwardly berating himself, he ran in the direction that Sentry had taken. Around the corner, Mello nearly fell into the sudden hole in the ground. With a split-second reaction, he leapt and cleared it with a jarring sensation that agonised his feet, and then spread up his legs. He touched the wall to steady himself and then danced on the top until the pins and needles subsided. It thankfully happened quite quickly. In the meantime, he peered back at what was, on further inspection, an open cellar entrance. Its wooden doors were thrown right back, and he was vaguely smug at the distance he had cleared in jumping over it. Inside was darkness. Mello gingerly tested his ability to walk and discovered that his legs had now recovered. He released his crucifix, but his hand tightened over it, and he stepped around the doors and crouched to peer inside. There was a smell of sulphur and chalk down there. "Sentry," he hissed, just as a gunshot sounded. Mello had always prided himself on his ability to keep still, even when startled. It had served him well in the mafia. While others panicked, dashing around like headless chickens, he seemed unflappable just sitting there. Even when the death note had flown preternaturally from his hand, even when a shinigami had appeared in front of him, even when a text message had told him that Kira was killing the mafia, while huge butch men had fled screaming for their mothers, Mello had not budged an inch. All of this was why it was even more personally shocking now that he did jump. His arm jolted, and the chain of the rosary, with its crucifix still clutched in his hand, snapped. Mello felt it go. He watched a bead fall down those steps into darkness. He saw the end of it loose in his hand. He froze inside, but there was someone shooting and he had no idea where it had come from. Mello dashed down the stairs into the darkness. His mind was a riot of conflicting thoughts. The safety of himself was paramount, though that was clenched in the fist of dread when he thought of Matt's safety. And Sentry out there with a phobia of guns. Was it Matt shooting? He was the only person other than Mello who had a gun, at least as far as Mello knew. He couldn't hear Sentry screaming. Was Sentry shooting? Maybe the phobia was an elaborate hoax in order to engender the element of surprise. Colliding with all of this were the messages coming from his nose, the distinct smell of rotten eggs and saltpetre. Gunpowder. He was smelling gunpowder. It was all around him. Mello's gun was in his hand, the other gripping the torn end of his rosary hard enough to risk crushing it. He stumbled into a shifting pile and heard something metallic crash down onto the floor. He jumped backwards. Weaving in and around these thoughts was another bred from pure emotion and memory, another rosary, another fallen bead, another loose crucifix in his hand, and the smell of burnt meat. Mello tried to rein that one in case it mentally in a granite hold, but it was incessant. A small child's pain and distress rose up inside him, nearly obliterating the adrenaline-driven adult. Mello choked back a sob, leaning against a wall, blinking back tears. This was neither the time nor the place for tears. His kitchen back at home had not been the moment either. There would never be a time to feel this, because Mello did not want to revisit that place. The Domovinsky rat was over. It wasn't here. There was a place where the cellar was filled with gunpowder and his family up above. Here was a place where his rosary was broken. Mello caught a breath and held it. Suddenly this was the Domovinsky rat, and his mind raced through images that he didn't want to see. His parents. He pushed them away, but the memories were coming thick and fast now. He was vaguely aware of feet running past the entrance to the basement, and a voice inside his head screamed for him to emerge. But he was far too distraught. Fear coursed through him. What if he was going mad again? Some inner self grabbed at a childhood memory. It was a poster. Soldiers in full kit marching towards the camera, holding their guns in their hands. They were slightly red and black against a plain white background, and the legend blazed out, "Hrvatska Vasjova." Mello blinked. Hrvatska didn't need him at all. He breathed fiercely into the air. "Mile Vasjova," and pushed himself up against the wall. He took several deep breaths, aware finally of how tightly he was gripping both crucifix and gun. He really needed chocolate right now. Mello sniffed, trying to assemble his thoughts all into something that made sense. He tried to find that stillness inside that all of their Wemmer's house trainings attempted to still into them. This was here and this was now. There was someone shooting, someone had been running. There was a cellar in darkness with stank of gunpowder. Mello hated the thought that he was trembling. He did not tremble. He never used to tremble. Whatever happened, he had to find Matt. That was the most important thing. He crept cautiously towards the stairs and peered up. There was a flash of light up near the top of the mountainside. It lit up the whole slope. Anti-aircraft? A bomb? The stench of gunpowder was overwhelming now. Mello turned back around, his night vision making out the shapes of boxes but nothing else. Why all of these weapons? If the bombs hit it, the whole building would blow. Ice flooded Mello's veins. His family was up there. There was a loud rumbling bang out onto the mountain. Mello actually cowered, then let pure rage right up to carry him. He roared out his defiance and span around with the intention to rush up the stairs. But the doors were closed. There were little patterns cut into the wood like peepholes through into the world. It was a spiral triscular, but in Mello's eyes he saw the fleur-de-lis, and through them only the flashes, the flames. It's the end of the chapter. Sorry, that was the end of a very long chapter. Brooke Stardust is saying she wants to find them all and hug them forever. I can't believe it took, what, about 35 minutes to read that chapter. I'm going to save that archive and then I'll come back to another chapter if you want me to.